In this lecture, we're going to look at some of the examples of the influence of Nietzsche, particularly in literature and art. We'll start here with a quote from the book A Room with a View. I fancy that they know how to read, a rare accomplishment. What have they got? Byron, exactly. A Shropshire lad? Never heard of it. The Way of All Flesh? Never heard of it. Gibbon? Hello, dear George reads German. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so we go on. Well, I suppose your generation knows its own business, Honeychurch. Now, I quite like this quote because although the book A Room with a View is not specifically about Nietzschean views, it actually does reflect the fact that the kind of ideas that Nietzsche had and was talking about are reflected in a lot of modern literature. And when we read these books, it's really interesting to see how they've influenced them. A Room with a View is actually a really easy read. There's a film as well if you fancy something pleasant to watch. And it's quite good fun to watch it as a gentle example of how Nietzsche has influenced literature. Now we're going to go on to look a little bit more seriously at some other examples, but this is a fun example for you. There are a lot of examples that we could look at when it comes to who Nietzsche influenced, so I'm just going to mention a few here. Now, we've got Thomas Mann, we have Thomas Hesse, we have George Bernard Shaw, we have the psychologist, of course, Freud Jung, who read Nietzsche, and we also have Alfred Adler. Now, Alfred Adler actually started an individual psychology that was based in Nietzsche's power dynamics. We also have people such as Ayn Rand, Trotsky, and D.H. Lawrence. Now, we're actually going to look at a couple of these in more detail, as well as a few that are not on this list, just to give us a little bit of an overview of Nietzsche's influence in literature and art. Our first example is Yeats, who lived from 1865 to 1939, and his poem The Second Coming. The poem was written in 1919 and published in 1920, and it describes the post-First World War Western culture. In the poem, the centre of Western traditions fail and anarchy breaks out. And we have the lines, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And the poem reflects the nihilism of Western culture at the time, the loss of value with nothing to replace them. We have again the lines, the ceremony of innocence is drowned, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The poem is really quite violent due to the revaluation of values with no order or structure to guide them. And this is really down to the lack of a strong and creative spirit. And the poem really shows the feeling at the time. And we can see how Nietzsche falls into that, the idea that with the death of God, we have this nihilism, that we have not yet moved towards this revaluation of values, because we haven't yet got that strong creative spirit. And at the end of the poem, it talks about this rough beast, its hour come at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. And so we see this imagery from Christianity coming into the poem, just as Nietzsche used Christian imagery in his work. Yeats then was an example of someone who was influenced by Nietzsche and who saw how Nietzschean ideas were reflected in modern society and then portrayed this through his poem. And I'll put a link up on Minerva to the full poem. The second example we will look at is Albert Camus, who lived from 1913 to 1960. One of his books that has been linked to Nietzschean thought is The Outsider, which was published in 1942. In Camus' work, he argues that if life is to have meaning, then we must live as if we have just emerged from prison. Camus believed that he was reacting against nihilism, and his thought has been linked with existentialism and also the absurd. And really his work shows a paradox, that we strive to make something of our lives, but are also aware that we will die and our efforts come to nothing. So these ideas fit in with Nietzsche's thought, particularly regarding the death of God and, of course, the revaluation of values, that life does not have an objective meaning, but then we must create our own. So his work is an example again of how Nietzsche's thought have influenced literature. A third example from literature is Thomas Mann, who lived from 1875 to 1955. There are two main texts that reflect his Nietzschean ideas, that of The Magic Mountain and Death of Venice. In The Magic Mountain, which was published in 1924, Thomas Mann's ideas reflect his ideas that art can come out of suffering, that there is a link between sickness and creativity. And this is an idea that reflects back to Nietzsche because, of course, Nietzsche believed that what troubled us could make us stronger. The idea of the eternal recurrence, that we must embrace life as it is. And Nietzsche was interested in how sickness and creativity could be linked together, how we could find creativity from the negatives in our lives. Death in Venice, which was published in 1912, shows the relationship between Apollo and Dionysus and suggests, as Spink said, that modern art culture needs to discover a productive relationship between the primal and mythic forces of life and aesthetic structures that enable us to experience these forces without being destroyed by them. So it comes back to these ideas from The Birth of Tragedy, where we're trying to look at a balance between Apollo and Dionysus, that we're trying to find a way of balancing our primal instincts with the more measured instincts of the Apollonian. So again, this is an example of how Nietzsche's thought have influenced writers in their creativity, and that these books have in turn gone on to be read and to influence views and perceptions of the world, even among people who may not have necessarily read the original philosophical ideas themselves. Our last example is an example from the art world. An artist that was influenced by Nietzsche was Mark Rothko, who lived from 1903 to 1970. Rothko was a successful American artist of Jewish descent, and although he rejected being tied to an art movement, he's generally associated with abstract expressionism. Rothko was very influenced by his readings of The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche, and Rothko believed that art could save us from the horror of life via myth. He sees himself as a myth maker, and much of his work references myths. So we have titles such as Antigone, Oedipus, The Furies. Rothko's work as he gets older turns to try and express the emptiness of modern life. And after World War II, he stopped naming and framing his pieces to allow for freedom of interpretation. Rothko was very interested in the concept of this life and that we needed to embrace the meaning that we could create. And we can see this in his interest in the observer's experience. As we said, after World War II, he stopped naming and framing his pieces. Now, the reason that he does this is that he wants the observer to have a really intense and meaningful relationship with the work of art. He wants them to be able to create their own interpretation. Rothko was very particular about how his artworks were displayed. He wanted them displayed with particular lighting settings, in particular arrangements, and not with other people's work. And the reason for this was to try and create this authentic experience that the observer would really be able to engage with the work of art. And I think that we can see Nietzsche's ideas here, not just from The Birth of Tragedy, but also this idea that one must be willing to embrace the experience that we have. We'll finish our example with a picture here, which is from 1953. It's untitled. And we have a quote from Rothko which says, "A painting is not a picture of an experience, but is the experience." And again, I think we can see the shadow of Nietzsche's ideas here and how they've influenced art, in that the painting is not just about portraying something you have experienced, but is itself the experience. And we can see here Nietzsche's ideas because of the idea of embracing this life, of not having a fixed interpretation of the work of art, but instead having one that we can create ourselves. In conclusion then, Nietzsche has had an influence on lots of writers and artists that we might not necessarily expect. And even where his ideas are not directly referenced, we can see shadows of his thought from many people who have read him or have read others who've been influenced by him. So, for example, here we have a quote, just for our final one, from Rilke, from Letters to a Young Poet. And although Rilke is not someone who was perhaps directly influenced by Nietzsche, he certainly read him. Rilke actually had a relationship with Lou Saloum, who of course you'll remember that Nietzsche proposed to unsuccessfully. And Rilke really does embrace this idea of needing to embrace life. And we could perhaps see some ideas here that come from Nietzsche. He says that only someone who is ready for everything, who doesn't exclude any experience, even the most incomprehensible, will live the relationship with another person as something alive and will himself sound the depths of his own being. And we can see here that lots of people were influenced by Nietzsche. And when you're reading modern literature, it's very interesting to see where we can spot the ideas, where we can spot the themes that run on through from Nietzsche and his thought.